When I first held my daughter in my arms, the world seemed to pause. Every sound outside the hospital room faded into a distant hum, and all I could hear was her soft breathing. I named her Aurora because her arrival felt like dawn after years of darkness. For 7 years, I had fought to become a mother, endless treatments, surgeries, and prayers whispered into sleepless nights. There were times when I nearly gave up, when hope felt too heavy to carry, but something deep inside me refused to surrender. And then, one spring morning, there she was, tiny, pink, and perfect, with my dimples and her father's bright blue eyes. The day I brought her home, I remember sitting in her nursery for hours, just watching her sleep. The walls were painted a gentle shade of lavender, sunlight spilling across the crib I had spent weeks assembling. My house, a little white cottage just outside Denver, had never felt more alive. Every inch of it carried traces of preparation: the folded baby clothes, the plush toys lined neatly on shelves, the rocking chair by the window where I'd already imagined singing lullabies. I believed, with all my heart, that this was the life I had been waiting for. For 6 months, Aurora filled that home with a kind of joy I didn't know existed. Her laughter, soft and tinkling, like wind chimes, was enough to wash away every scar left by years of struggle. Mornings began with her coos echoing through the hallway, and nights ended with her curled against my chest, her tiny hand gripping my finger as if afraid to let go. I took photos of everything: her first smile, her first time rolling over, even the way her hair curled slightly after a bath. My camera roll was full, my heart fuller. Then came the morning that changed everything. Aurora didn't wake up smiling. She was warm, her little forehead burning beneath my palm. The pediatrician said it was probably just a fever. Nothing serious, he assured me. I held on to those words like a lifeline. But within days, the fever climbed higher. Her laughter faded. Her eyes, once so full of life, became heavy and glassy. I rushed her to the hospital, clutching her to my chest as if I could protect her from the world. They admitted her to the ICU almost immediately. I remember the cold air, the sterile smell, and the way the machines beeped in a steady rhythm that mocked the pounding of my heart. I sat beside her bed, whispering prayers, stories, and promises. I told her about all the places we would go, all the birthdays we would celebrate. I told her that she was my reason for breathing, that I would give anything for her to stay. But the universe didn't bargain. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, Aurora slipped away in my arms. One moment she was there, and the next she wasn't. There was no warning, no grand goodbye, just silence. I remember screaming, but even my voice felt muted. The nurses tried to comfort me, their faces blurred by my tears. All I could think was that I had failed. I had failed to protect the one thing that made my life worth living. Afterward, the days melted together. I planned her funeral in a haze, picking out flowers and a tiny white casket as if I were living someone else's nightmare. The world outside carried on. Cars moved, people laughed, but I moved through it like a ghost. I called my parents, hoping for support, for any sign that I wasn't alone in this unbearable darkness. My mother's voice was calm, almost detached. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, "we're so sorry, but your brother's hosting a big event this weekend. We can't just cancel." I thought I had misheard. "Mom," I said, my voice breaking, "it's Aurora's funeral." "I know, but we'll come visit next week," she replied. "You understand how important this is for Daniel." Important. That word echoed in my head like a cruel joke. My brother's pool party in Miami was apparently more important than my daughter's farewell. My father didn't even call. The next day, I saw photos online, my family smiling by the pool, drinks in hand, while I stood alone beside a tiny grave. That was the day something inside me cracked. It wasn't just grief, it was betrayal. I realized that the family I had spent my whole life trying to please had never really seen me. I had been invisible, the afterthought, the daughter who made her own way while they poured their love and money into Daniel's easy life. For years, I told myself it didn't matter. I thought love was about forgiving. But standing there in that empty cemetery, I understood something for the first time. Forgiveness isn't weakness, but forgetting who people truly are, can destroy you. The house that had once been filled with laughter became painfully quiet. I kept the nursery door closed because I couldn't bear to see her crib. Some nights, I would sit outside her room, listening for sounds that weren't there. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't speak without my throat closing. Friends stopped calling after a while. People don't know what to say to grief that deep. It was in that silence, in that unbearable solitude, that something unexpected began to take root. I don't think it was strength, not yet, but it was the faintest spark of resolve. I told myself that if I survived this, I would make sure her name meant something to me. Aurora had brought light into my life, and even if she was gone, her light didn't have to fade. I didn't know how or when or what it would look like, but I made a silent promise to her, to myself, that one day the world would remember her. And that was the beginning of everything that came after. The woman I became, the empire of healing I built, and the quiet power I discovered buried beneath the ashes of my pain. That night, as I stood by her grave under the cold Denver moon, I whispered into the wind, "You may be gone, my love, but your light will never die." And I meant it. The first year after Aurora's death was a blur of gray mornings and sleepless nights. I moved through life like a shadow, my body present but my soul somewhere else, stuck in a nursery filled with silence. The crib was still by the window, untouched. Her favorite pink blanket still carried her scent, and sometimes I'd sit there in the dark, holding it against my chest, waiting for a feeling that never came. My house, once so warm and full of laughter, became a mausoleum. Every creak of the floorboards reminded me of what I'd lost. People told me grief would soften with time. They said I'd find a way to move on. But those words felt hollow, like a language invented by people who had never lost their hearts. I didn't want to move on. I wanted to give her life meaning. And deep down, I knew that the only way to survive was to make sure Aurora's short life left a lasting mark on the world. It started small, one night when I couldn't sleep. I was scrolling through stories on a grief support forum, reading the pain of parents who felt just as invisible as I did. They had lost children and, like me, had no one to talk to. Some couldn't afford funerals, and others were drowning in medical bills. I saw myself in every story. That night, a thought settled in my chest. What if I could create a space for people like us? A place where parents didn't have to grieve alone? The next morning, I took $20,000 from my savings, money I had once set aside for Aurora's college fund, and began building something new. I registered a small nonprofit in Denver and called it Aurora's Light Foundation. I wanted her name to shine in places she never got to see. I started in my living room, using a borrowed laptop from a neighbor. I designed a simple website that explains our mission: to support grieving parents during emotional and financial hardship. We offered therapy referrals, funeral aid, and care packages filled with handwritten letters from parents who understood the pain of loss. At first, it felt impossible. I wrote every email, made every phone call, and packed every box myself. Some days, I barely had the energy to get out of bed, but every time I thought of giving up, I'd picture Aurora's face. I'd remember her tiny hands and the way she laughed when I sang off-key. That memory kept me going. Slowly, something began to shift. A mother from Oregon wrote to thank me after receiving one of our care packages. Then a man from Texas sent a $500 donation, saying our story reminded him of his late wife and baby boy. A local newspaper ran a small piece about the foundation, calling it a light for those lost in darkness. And that light began to spread. Within a year, I had a small team of volunteers, parents, therapists, and community members who wanted to help. We started organizing support groups and virtual counseling sessions. By the second year, we had enough funding to rent a small office space in downtown Denver. I remember sitting in that office on the day we opened, surrounded by donated furniture and secondhand computers, and thinking, we're really doing this. The foundation grew faster than I could have imagined. We partnered with hospitals in Chicago and Los Angeles, providing emergency grants for funeral costs. We launched workshops for mental health professionals to better understand parental grief. Reporters started calling me the woman who turned loss into light. I didn't feel like a hero, just a mother trying to keep her daughter's name alive. But when I saw the impact we were making, I felt a quiet sense of peace for the first time in years. Still, there were nights when old wounds reopened. I'd watch families at our support events, mothers and fathers crying together, holding each other. And I'd think of my own family. My parents had never once reached out. Not after the funeral, not after the newspaper articles, not even after the foundation started gaining national attention. They lived their lives as though I and Aurora had never existed. That silence, more than anything, kept a small ache in my chest. I told myself I had let it go, but the truth was I hadn't. Their betrayal still lived in me like an unhealed scar. Every success I had was a quiet rebellion against their neglect. Every ribbon cutting, every interview, every donation was proof that I didn't need their love to build something meaningful. Then, one crisp winter morning, as snowflakes dusted the window outside my office, an envelope arrived. It was thick, sealed with a wax stamp, and addressed to me in a handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Inside was a letter from a law firm in Boston. My Aunt Margaret had passed away. Aunt Margaret was my mother's older sister, a woman I had always adored. She was quiet, elegant, and fiercely kind. Unlike the rest of my family, she had attended Aurora's funeral. She didn't say much that day. She just held my hand and told me that my daughter's light would never truly fade. After that, she had sent me a card every Christmas, even when the rest of my family didn't bother. I hadn't seen her in years, and yet, in her will, she had left me everything. I stared at the letter in disbelief. She had owned several properties across the country, including a luxury mountain resort in Aspen. The estimated value of her estate was $8.7 million. For a moment, I couldn't process it. I felt a mix of grief, gratitude, and shock. Aunt Margaret had quietly believed in me all along, even when my own parents hadn't. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents had always boasted about attending Daniel's birthday parties at that very same Aspen resort. Now, the place they used to flaunt was legally mine. I didn't tell anyone right away. I sat with the news, thinking about what it meant. Part of me wanted to call my parents, to see their reaction, but another part of me, the wiser part, knew that silence was its own kind of power. I decided to visit the resort myself before making any decisions. When I arrived a week later, the air was crisp and sharp, the snow glistening under the sunlight. The building stood tall against the mountains, elegant and serene. As I walked through the grand lobby, I could almost hear the echo of laughter, the kind that once excluded me. But this time I didn't feel small. I didn't feel forgotten. I felt in control. That night, sitting by the fire in one of the suites overlooking the mountains, I realized something profound. The universe had finally given me the chance to reclaim what was taken from me, not through revenge, but through destiny. And though I didn't know it yet, that inheritance would soon become the stage where every wrong in my past would be quietly rewritten. 6 months after inheriting Aunt Margaret's estate, I stood before the glass doors of the Aspen Summit Resort, the same place my parents once called their happy escape. The building rose like a jewel against the Colorado mountains, its walls glimmering in the winter sunlight. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, landing softly on the black marble steps beneath my boots. I had dreamed of this moment without even realizing it. Once, they had celebrated here while I buried my daughter. Now I owned it, every key, every chandelier, every inch of it was mine. When I first received the deed, I decided to keep my ownership a secret. I wanted to understand what the place meant, not just to them, but to me. The staff believed I was an investor evaluating operations. They had no idea the woman walking their polished floors was the new owner. I walked through the grand lobby, where firelight shimmered across crystal walls and violins played softly in the background. I could almost hear echoes from years ago. My mother's laughter, my father's boastful voice, my brother's shallow jokes. The same laughter that had filled their pool party while I stood alone beside my baby's grave. I took a deep breath and reminded myself why I was there. This was no longer a monument to their indulgence. It was a symbol of survival. I met with the resort manager, a polite man named Colin, who spoke with a mix of formality and curiosity. "Miss Rhodes," he said, unaware of our connection. "We have a booking request for next month. It's under a family name. I believe you might recognize Daniel and Elaine Rhodes. They're reserving the West Wing for a private event. Should I confirm it?" The words hung in the air for a moment. My pulse quickened. "No," I said calmly. "Not yet. Let the booking stand, but inform me personally the moment they arrive. I'll handle the rest." He nodded, unaware of the storm beneath my steady tone. Over the following weeks, I prepared quietly. The staff received subtle instructions, adjustments to policies, and a few personal notes about hospitality. But deep down, this was more than preparation, it was reclamation. For years, I had been the forgotten daughter, the invisible sister. Now, fate had handed me a mirror to hold up to them. I didn't crave revenge, but I couldn't ignore the poetry in what was unfolding. The day of the event arrived on a crisp Saturday afternoon in December. The mountains gleamed white under the winter sun, and the resort buzzed with activity. I stood on the balcony of the second floor, overlooking the circular driveway as luxury cars rolled in one by one. Guests in tailored coats and glittering dresses stepped out, chattering about Daniel's milestone celebration. And then I saw them, my parents, stepping out of a black Mercedes, both dressed in expensive winter clothes. My mother wore her signature pearls and that same rehearsed smile that had charmed countless dinner parties. My father adjusted his coat with practiced confidence. Behind them, my brother Daniel emerged, flashing his perfect grin at the photographers. He had always been the favorite, the golden child who could do no wrong. As they walked toward the entrance, I felt my stomach twist with something sharp and electric. They didn't recognize the woman watching them from above. Inside, I waited until they reached the front desk. I watched my mother lean on the counter, her tone brisk and entitled. "Reservation under Rhodes," she said. "The presidential suite, please." The manager glanced toward me across the lobby. I gave him a small nod and stepped forward. My heels echoed against the marble floor as I descended the staircase. The crowd slowly quieted. I could feel their eyes on me, the curious whispers rising like soft wind. "Welcome to Aspen Summit," I said, my voice calm but clear. "I hope the drive was nice." My mother turned, blinking in surprise. "Oh, darling, what are you doing here?" Her voice had that polished sweetness she used when she didn't know how to react. I smiled faintly. "Working. This resort, every suite, every key, it's mine now." The silence that followed was almost cinematic. My father's brows furrowed. Daniel gave a forced laugh, the kind people use to disguise panic. "Come on, that's a good one. Very funny." Colin, the manager, stepped forward with a folder in his hands. "She's telling the truth," he said. "Ms. Rhodes is the legal owner of the property. We finalized the transfer 6 months ago." My mother's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no words came out. My father looked from me to the folder, then back again, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and discomfort. "I think there's been some kind of mistake," my mother stammered. "This resort, this is where we always stay." "I know," I said softly. "You've made wonderful memories here. Just not the kind I was ever invited to." Daniel's smile disappeared. "You can't just, deny us entry? That's ridiculous. We're family." The word family hit me like a stone. Family. The same word they used while abandoning me when I needed them most. I took a step closer, meeting my mother's eyes. "When my daughter died, I called you," I said. "You chose a pool party instead of her funeral. So, no, you don't get to use that word here." My voice didn't rise, but the weight of it filled the room. The guests had fallen completely silent, every head turned toward us. My father tried to speak, but I held up a hand. "This resort doesn't host guests who abandon family," I said. "You'll need to make other arrangements." Their pride collapsed faster, than I expected. My mother's composure cracked first. Her eyes darted around, looking for someone to rescue her from the humiliation. Daniel muttered something under his breath about lawyers, but his voice shook. My father stayed silent, jaw tight, unable to meet my gaze. I turned to the manager. See that their deposit is refunded. They won't be staying here. Yes, ma'am, he said firmly. For a long moment, no one moved. Then my mother took my father's arm, her face pale as she whispered, "Let's go." They left without another word, their designer shoes clicking against the marble as if retreating from the very ghosts they had created. When the doors closed behind them, I felt something lift inside me. It wasn't victory, not exactly. It was released. For the first time in years, I didn't tremble in their presence. I didn't crave their approval or their affection. I stood in the very place that once represented their success, and it now represented my peace. As the staff returned to work and the music resumed, I went back to the balcony and looked out at the mountains. Snow was falling softly again, blanketing the world in quiet stillness. I thought of Aurora, my little girl with the bright eyes and the laugh that sounded like spring, and I whispered, "We did it, baby. We really did." The world outside shimmered with light, and for the first time since she was gone, I felt her presence not as pain but as warmth. That night, I didn't dream of loss or betrayal. I dreamed of beginnings. Years passed, and life slowly reshaped itself around the spaces Aurora once filled. The pain never vanished, but it softened, changing from a sharp wound into a quiet ache that reminded me she had existed, that she had mattered. Aurora's light foundation grew into something far greater than I had ever dreamed. What had begun as a small support network run from my living room became a national force for healing. We built grief centers in 5 states, partnered with hospitals across the country, and launched a research fund for childhood illness prevention. Every time I stood on a stage to speak about our work, I felt Aurora's spirit beside me. Our programs reached thousands of parents who once sat alone in the dark, as I had. We offered therapy, retreats, and even scholarships in honor of lost children. People began calling me the woman who turned grief into grace. But I knew the truth. I hadn't done it alone. My daughter's memory was the heartbeat behind every act of kindness that the foundation ever gave. Despite all of that, some wounds never fully healed. I had forgiven my parents, or so I told myself, but deep down, their betrayal still haunted me. Even when success surrounded me, there was a quiet emptiness where their love should have been. I had learned to live without them, to thrive without their approval, but occasionally, that small, childlike part of me still wished they would call. They never did. Then one afternoon, nearly 6 years after the confrontation at the Aspen resort, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was one I recognized immediately. "Hello," my mother said, her tone hesitant, unfamiliar. "It's been a while." I didn't respond right away. Part of me expected an apology. Another part braced for disappointment. She continued, "Your father's business collapsed. He made some bad investments, something about a failed construction deal. The house in Denver is being repossessed. We don't have anywhere to go." For a long moment, I said nothing. My mind flickered through memories, her laughter at my brother's parties, her silence at my daughter's funeral, the way she had looked at me in Aspen when I told her the resort was mine. Finally, I said softly, "I'm sorry to hear that." There was a pause. Then, in a voice trembling with pride and fear, she whispered, "We're not asking for much. Just some help. Maybe a loan. We could stay with you until things settle." I almost laughed, not out of cruelty, but disbelief. The same parents who had treated me like a stranger were now reaching out to me because they had nowhere else to go. For years, they'd chosen comfort over compassion, pride over love. And now, their pride had turned to ashes. "I'll think about it," I said quietly, then ended the call. For days, I wrestled with what to do. The angry part of me wanted to turn away, to let them feel what I had once felt. But Aurora's memory always guided my choices. Every time I looked at her photograph on my desk, I heard her laughter in my mind, light and forgiving. I realized vengeance would only poison the peace I had worked so hard to build. So, I made a different decision. I contacted their bank, negotiated discreetly, and purchased the Denver house outright. The paperwork took weeks, but by the end of the month, the property was legally mine. I didn't tell them. I wanted to be sure of my intentions before revealing anything. When my parents found out, they called me in shock. My father's voice cracked for the first time in my life. "You bought the house," he said. "Does that mean we can stay?" I didn't answer immediately. "I'll be in touch soon," I said and hung up. 3 months later, I organized a small ceremony at the house. Invitations went out under the foundation's letterhead, not my name. It was described as a donation event in memory of Aurora Rhodes. My parents assumed I was reopening the home as a personal project, perhaps finally ready to let go of old grudges. They arrived dressed elegantly, as if attending a social function, not realizing what was truly about to happen. The day was warm, the garden in full bloom. Roses climbed the fence in soft pink clusters, the same color I had painted Aurora's nursery years before. Guests filled the backyard. Donors, volunteers, counselors, and a few families who had found hope through our programs. When it was time, I stood on the small stage near the patio and took a deep breath. My parents were seated in the front row. My mother smiled faintly, as if waiting for me to hand them their redemption. My father looked uneasy, his pride fraying at the edges. "Thank you all for being here today," I began. "This house once belonged to my family. It's where I grew up, where I learned what love should have been, and sometimes wasn't. Years ago, when I lost my daughter, I thought this home would forever represent pain. But over time, I realized pain can become purpose." I looked directly at my parents then. My mother's eyes darted between me and the crowd. My father's hands tightened on his knees. "Today," I continued, my voice steady, "I'm donating this home to Aurora's Light Foundation. It will become our first grief retreat center, a sanctuary for parents who've lost children, a place where no one will ever feel abandoned." Gasps rippled through the audience. My mother's face crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes. My father bowed his head, his expression unreadable. For the first time, I didn't see defiance in him, only defeat. I stepped down from the stage and walked toward them. "This house will bring healing to others," I said softly. That's what Aurora would have wanted. My mother reached for my hand, but I didn't take it. Instead, I placed a white rose in her lap. "It's time to let go," I whispered. They left quietly after the ceremony. There were no angry words, no accusations, just silence. And in that silence, I finally felt free. Over the next few months, renovations began. The rooms were transformed into warm, welcoming spaces filled with sunlight and art. The old master bedroom became a counseling office. My childhood room was turned into a meditation space. By spring, the first families arrived, mothers and fathers carrying framed photos, small toys, and stories of children gone too soon. I visited often. Each time, I saw life blooming where pain once lived. Laughter returned to those walls, not the shallow kind my family once filled it with, but laughter born from healing, from remembering with love instead of despair. Now, every spring, I walk through the garden myself. The roses bloom early, their petals brushing my fingers as I pass. I stop by the plaque near the front steps that reads, "Aurora's house, where love never dies." The wind always feels gentler there, as if carrying her spirit across the blossoms. Through loss, betrayal, and rebirth, I learned something that took me years to understand. Revenge may satisfy the moment, but healing transforms the soul. And as I stand among the roses, I know I've kept my promise to my daughter. Her light didn't fade. It simply became mine.